we have to understand that multiple action across multiple sectors is not the same as multi-sector joint action. There were lots of things happening, but that doesn't mean they were well coordinated, nor were they necessarily planned to be coordinated. Layering of actions can be beneficial depending on if you have coverage and the right targeting, but it doesn't guarantee that coordination is actually happening. So what we're also seeing since then is that G20 governments, and that includes many of the governments that were directly involved in this crisis, impacted by this crisis, on average, a G20 member has been imposing essentially discriminatory or protectionist measures on average once every 3 days over the past 6 months, despite repeated pledges that we need to fix the global system, remove protectionism, and move towards more open agendas. The G20 are apparently, according to a new study, not necessarily sticking to that. So we need to, in conclusion, try and understand not just the impact of shocks, but understand that exogenous to that problem is what other people do in response, not just to the shock, but what they expect to happen from that shock, what they expect other people to do or not do, institutions or governments, be they national or international. The indirect impacts matter when we may be talking about a food crisis, but the indirect impact on health-seeking behavior, on schooling, on all kinds of other domains matter immensely. As the share of expenditure on food rises, we have to understand a lot more where is expenditure not happening, because all of that has impact on nutrition. So, and finally, a plea for understanding what goes on in terms of chronic risks. The attention to wasting as a humanitarian measure of nutrition, the focus on food supply or shortage or gaps thereof, yeah, they matter, but in the long run, we also need to be understanding what can we do in the context of crises that won't make stunting, access to food, micronutrient-rich diets harder, and of course we then have to deal with the implications of obesity. Will investments that have been made, targeting actions that have been done during these last 2 years, will they be sustained? Will they continue to be effective? We don't know, but we do need to find out, because this is not the last crisis.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let's have a hand for it. I don't know that my mic is on. For even people who hadn't had Economics 101, I'm sure you could understand the lucidity of that presentation. Now, the next person who's going to stand up is not Prabhu Pangali. He could not make it. The next person who's going to stand up is Marie Joël, and she will explain who she is, why she's here, and what she's going to talk about. So, Marie?
Yes, good afternoon. As I said, I had a moment of weakness just as I was boarding for coming to Bangkok. Prabhu called me and asked me if I could give his talk. And I said yes, and so he sent me a set of slides. So I'm really not presenting the views of IFPRI here. I work at the International Food Policy Research Institute. I'm director of the Poverty, Health, and Nutrition Division. But I'm just delivering Prabhu's talk. And so it will be hard for me to answer the questions related to what's the position of the Gates Foundation and with regards to the crises. But at least
she's going to answer the questions for herself.
Yeah, and I will just leave running at 1:30. Here are Prabhu's slides. What do we know? And you will be very interested to see that his first slide is the same as we've seen a lot of in Patrick's presentation. Basically describing here the price bubble, showing exactly the same trends in 3 commodities, and showing that the prices have gone back down. In the FAO food price index show that the prices have fallen back by 1/3 from last June's peak. So what were these food price spikes attributed to? And again, Patrick has covered quite a bit of that. The slides from Prabhu are interpreting that it's in part due to structural changes in demand. We all know that with population growth and with urbanization and globalization, there's been a lot of changes in the demand for food, and largely China has been a driver of these changes. And even India is also weighing in the balance. The use of food crops or for biofuels is also important. But obviously, these are not what caused the price bubble, because this was such a fast growing price spike and an equally fast decrease in the prices. So speculation played a more important role than just the changes in demand here. The agricultural outlooks predict that prices will remain high, above their 2003 levels over the next 10 years. And they will level off at the historical negative trends that we had seen up to then. The crisis is widely perceived to have led to substantial increases in malnutrition and poverty, but as Patrick was saying, we really don't have much information that substantiates especially the impacts on malnutrition. The food crisis was widely covered by the media. We have to remember that now we have the financial crisis, which has largely eclipsed the media, and now there's more of a blur about what's going on. It's an economic crisis. It's not so much food and we need more food and we need more agriculture. It's more how do we help poor people respond to the multiple shocks. What are the impacts? What do we know? In terms of hunger, FAO estimates that the food crisis resulted in an increase in the number of chronically hungry people worldwide to an estimated 963 million, close to 1 billion. The share of hungry as an estimate of the global population increased to 1995-97 levels, meaning that we're going backwards in terms of trying to meet the MDGs. In terms of poverty, the World Bank estimates that the total world poverty may have increased by 73 to 105 million people due to the recent food price increases. Again, those are not even the latest numbers that take into account the unfolding economic crisis. 30 million additional people, additional persons in Africa alone have become poor. The distribution of impacts, again, this is a topic that Patrick covered a little bit. The price transmission varies greatly from country to country, and it's based on their infrastructure and their specific policies. The reliance on imports, for example, have great implications for national budgets, especially for rice importers, given the very high spike in the price of rice during that period. There are still many important questions that are not resolved. The distribution of impacts need to be studied. It's hard to predict. We don't really have the answer to exactly where the impacts are greatest. What should be the priority supply responses, and what is the medium and long-term outlook? In terms of the evidence that we have on the distribution of impacts, are rural populations suffering more than the urban populations? There is not really such a large evidence that the urban suffer more, in spite of the fact that we would imagine that they do, because the urban population is largely net buyers of food. However, there's a large proportion of the rural poor that are also net buyers, meaning that they purchase more than what they produce. In spite of the fact that they may produce food, they still have to purchase a large proportion of their food, and therefore all the net buyers, and especially the poorest of the poor, will suffer the most. The question about what's the localization, the infrastructure, and the relative movement of food, fuel, and fertilizer prices effects, as well as confounding factors. So within countries, there are large differences, even geographically, but also depending on the characteristics of certain regions. Impacts on household, as I said, the net buyers, also women-headed households are seen as suffering the most. They are poor usually, and